Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 107th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And on today's episode, I'm reviewing the book Culture Map by Erin Meyers, published in 2014. As the theme for September is culture, I thought this would be a perfect book to talk about and review, because culture is one of those things that is often overlooked. And if you listened to last week's episode with Dr. Natalie Van Meurs, we talked about the fact there's no such thing as Greenwich Mean Time culture. However, many workplaces don't talk about this and struggle to pinpoint individual, team, and organizational cultures. And yet there seems to be an implicit way of, quote unquote, the way things are done around here. And it can be much easier to talk about culture than race. And I do think if you care about equality, diversity, and people often talk about belonging as well, it's essential to talk about culture and explore what culture means in the workplace. I think one of the biggest issues is about the culture of communication and how we come at things with our own lens. And in order to understand what someone else's norm is, we have to understand our own. And don't forget, if you're enjoying the content of this podcast, why not subscribe to my newsletter? It's bi-monthly and you'll receive a free copy of the Mentally Healthy Leading Manager ebook. Okay, so let's delve into the book a bit further. Erin Meyers is a professor at INSEAD, one of the world's leading business schools in France. And what she does in this book is to draw together academic research in an accessible way and format. So she has drawn things from Edward T. Hall, she's translated research done by many scholars into an accessible language and has created dimensions that are helpful to understand intercultural relationships. But as Natalie Van Meurs said last week, often culture researchers stand on the shoulder of giants, and these giants are thought to be Hofstede, Gelfand, Schwartz, Trompenas, and the Globe Studies. The Globe Studies is a really interesting worldwide study into leadership, and they've just updated their latest study from 2020, so do have a look at the website, and the link is in the show notes. And some of the theories like Edward T. Hall's, which I talk about a lot, work on low context and high context culture as such a useful framework. But there's also communication research by Ting Tomey that's key and specific to negotiation is Jean Brett's work from Harvard. But what I find really helpful about this book is the fact that Erin also uses personal anecdotes from her years of working in corporate environments and cultural misunderstandings that have taken place across the years. She states very clearly in the book at the start that the sad truth is the vast majority of managers who conduct business internationally have little understanding about how the culture is impacting their work. She also makes an important point that yes, an individual is important. However, we all have a responsibility to know and understand cultural context to be able to open up a conversation and not lay on unhelpful stereotypes. So it's also not about pigeonholing people and saying they all have exactly the same personalities if they're from a particular country, because that's not the case, but more about what are the social norms and contexts in which we are used to operating in. What we accept as normal, usually the way things are done around here, will not be the same for everyone. And it's knowing this that's key. And of course, within this, we all have human experience and commonality. So it's important not to forget that. So she covers 8 really important and key aspects of culture. So the first one is around communication across culture, the way language is used and preference. Secondly, evaluation performance, so directness and or indirectness, what clarity is in a culture and what it isn't. The third area is persuasion, person-centered or fact-based. Is it too detailed? Is it more based on the outcomes, which leads to this really interesting point about macro to micro or micro to macro. So I just wanted to read one of her insights from the book. She says, for example, Chinese people think from macro to micro, whereas Western people think from micro to macro. So for example, when writing an address, the Chinese write in sequence of province, city, district, block, gate, number. And the Westerners do the opposite. They start with a number of a single house and gradually work their way up to the city and state. In the same way, Chinese put the surname first, whereas Westerners do it the other way around. And Chinese put the year before the month and date. And again, it's opposite in the West. So this is interesting. And if anyone knows about Confucianist leadership theories, and I do talk about this in Where Culture and Leadership Combine, it's always about connections and the bigger picture, and the fact that particularly Southeast Asian cultures are very collectivist. And I thought this was a really beautiful example of that. Whereas in Western cultures, it's much more about the individual. So your house number comes first. And that was something I didn't know. So I think that was really useful. But this book is kind of dotted with these really interesting perspectives that people have. The fourth area is leadership, hierarchy, and power. So the way in which it's a clear hierarchy or an egalitarian, flatter structure. And I remember many years ago attending an event at the Side Business School where their recent MBA graduates were giving kind of mini talks around their journey and how they could help women excel in their goals and their careers. And I was put in this group, and it was with a woman who was Russian. She talked very openly about being Russian, and she just completed her MBA. And in this, she said, there are things that you learn in Russia that are very different in the UK. And one of them is that your manager is always right. And if you think your manager is wrong, go and check again, because your manager is always right. So this thing about hierarchy, and actually there is an example in the book around Swedish culture versus Russian culture and the differences around that, egalitarian versus very hierarchical. And I think to me, this is really fascinating. And it can be summarized. There's a really useful table in the book around general traits of egalitarian culture. And I'm focusing on this because this is something I think that the UK, it depends on the organization, but I think we aim to be egalitarian, but particularly in higher education and the government, it is very hierarchical. So the general traits as outlined in this book about egalitarian culture: it's okay to disagree with the boss openly, even in front of others. People are more likely to move to action without getting the boss's okay. If meeting with a client or supplier, there is less focus on matching hierarchical levels. It's okay to email or call people several levels below or above you. With clients or partners, you'll be seated and spoken to in no specific order. Now, that really doesn't resonate to me about the UK workplace. I do think it is more hierarchical. So here are some of the general traits of hierarchical cultures. An effort is made to defer to the boss's opinion, especially in public. People are more likely to get the boss's approval before moving to action. If you send your boss, they will send their boss. If your boss cancels, their boss may also not come. Communication follows the hierarchical chain, and with clients or partners, you may be seated and spoken to in order of position. So I think there have been some shifts in the UK. I don't think it's quite like that, but I definitely don't. To me, the egalitarian work culture doesn't really resonate. Then the next area is about decision making. So how much discussion there is with decision making prior to implementation. And I'm laughing because there can be a real sense in the UK, can't there, around consultation. So lots of consensus, but I feel like the consensus is often thrown away in this country. Whereas I think in Southeast Asian culture, yes, there's hierarchy, but there's also lots of consensus to get to the decision. So is it more of an autocratic style? Is a decision made by the boss? But as I said, it's more nuanced than this, or is it a sense of we just keep talking and then when everyone's happy, we move forward with that decision? Trust. So this is where the trust in the workplace is based on skills. I trust you because you have a high level of expertise and excellence and skills. Or is it also about empathy, friendship, and emotion? So establishing social connections and deep connections versus superficial relationships. Disagreement is the next one, and conflict management. So avoiding and leaning into confrontation. And to me, this was one of the most interesting elements of the book. And I've actually used the model in the book in training to look at why maybe we're much more reticent in the UK and avoidant to talk about racism at work because it feels very confrontational, along with other things. I think that's one part of the picture. And it also links to being emotionally expressive too. So there are cultures that are emotionally expressive and are also okay with confrontation. So one of the countries that you might think of, and it's actually listed in the book, is Italy, where emotions, people wear their heart on the sleeves, they might shout, they're really open to confrontation. And in other countries, that's not the case, but they may be much more happy to disagree. And those countries are thought to be Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany. So not, emotions don't pour out, but confrontation is okay. And then countries that are emotionally expressive and that avoid confrontation, countries listed are India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Mexico, Peru, and the Philippines. So happy to express emotion, but don't want to get into a confrontation. And those are generally thought to be much higher context cultures where it's about deference, where community is really important, where they're more collectivist. And then interestingly, countries where confrontation is avoided and they're thought to be emotionally unexpressive, the UK is in there, but also Sweden, China, Korea, and Japan. So yes, these are broad brushstrokes. And also what this chart misses is a number, well, actually there are no African countries on there. So no countries in the continent of Africa. I don't know why, and probably it's a case of there's not enough research done on these countries. But to me, that's very interesting. And I think it explains a lot. And those of us who might feel that we are maybe straddle different cultures because we're from diaspora communities or we grew up in a particular country, may sort of see us floating through that. And of course, we may have different confrontational styles at home versus the workplace. But to me, that was a real light bulb moment. It's super interesting. And then timekeeping. This is always a fascinating one, isn't it? Because timekeeping varies in families, so family cultures, and thinking about scheduling. So how timekeeping is important or not. So linear time and abiding by timings versus flexible timekeeping and interruptions being accepted. And another little insight I wanted to read, because this really, I just thought captured it all so beautifully, was the difference between Nigerian culture in relation to timekeeping and German culture in relation to timekeeping. So it's one of the people on the INSEAD's Global Virtual Teams program. She shares something that they said, and they shared, they're from the Nigerian background, and they said the Germans plan everything not just weeks but months in advance. Last week, 3 months before a conference I will attend in Germany, I received an email asking me to choose from 3 options. What do I want to have for dinner at the conference opener on 6th of April? Now, let me ask you, how can I be expected to know today, a day in January, what I'm going to want to eat on April the 6th? But this is no joke. If you don't check the box, schedule your meal choice and return it by the stated date, someone will start hunting you by email. So isn't this fascinating? And often why people think, why do you keep bothering me? And other people are saying, no, but we need the information. These are very useful insights and tips to provide understanding and communication. And this is the practical element of the book really appealed to me. And again, looking at where the UK sits, she gives some other examples throughout the book as someone who doesn't always feel wholly down with the subtleties of British culture and being part of the wider diaspora community, which links to politeness and hierarchy. But I often find it difficult to ascertain exactly what's going on. And as I mentioned, I think this book was published in 2014. We've had the pandemic. So how things will have shifted, I think, again, that's another really interesting point. Also, how countries have responded to the pandemic in terms of cultural profile preferences and norms is a hugely interesting area. And I mentioned, that not enough countries within the continent of Africa are covered. I think that's a real shame because I think there is so much diversity there, and to be able to understand that, also the different languages spoken and how that contributes to culture would have been very fascinating to know more about. And I'm sure there is more information out there, but in terms of this particular book, but also the intracultural differences that are also inevitable. As you know me, I always say one size doesn't fit all. So yes, there will be commonalities within cultural and social norms within a country context. But I also think that history and journey and being a minority within your own culture will play a huge part. So, and I think something that might be missing as well is how things have changed and shifted over time with industrialization or not, global politics, countries that have been part of a dictatorship, that culture will shift. If you look at the different ways in which, I'm not an expert on Russian history, but from the Tsar to the modern day and all the changes in between, of course, that's going to have an impact on culture. Whether family-run enterprises have been supported, that's going to have an impact on the way business has been run. So I appreciate this book can't cover everything, but I would have liked to see a little bit more about that. So I think, how can you use this book in your workplace? And it's not necessarily about solving it all. I don't think this is a case of solving it. We always talk about equality, diversity, inclusion, and I put culture into that being more of a journey, not a destination. So it's a case of how you can be more cognizant and integrate this into everyday thinking and planning, thinking about our individual culture, our team culture, our organizational culture. And even if you're a solopreneur or you have a small business with just 5 people, what is the culture that you're setting? So even if you're not a global organization, this discussion about culture is essential. And this is exactly what I do in my cultural awareness training courses that I have been running since 2009 from the University of Oxford and beyond. So I've adapted the training, I've used different thinking, and I think books like this are so essential for practitioners to really help our understanding and get different perspectives. So in essence, it can be easier to talk about culture than race equality, but talking about culture can help open up the conversation about race. It's not assuming everyone from a particular place has the same personality. Of course, we value the individual within the broad brushstroke frameworks around culture. However, it's very useful to understand social norms and expectations and what the benchmark is, and to help us understand, how we have these conversations about our own culture, what our expectations are. And in fact, if you're interested, you can do the profiler on Erin Meyers' website. And I did it. And this was an interesting one for me. So you choose the country that you most identify with, you answer certain questions, and it maps your profile against the nationality that you most identify with. And for me, my communicating is very direct, which isn't really in keeping with my heritage diaspora culture. It's actually more direct than the UK. I like to give direct negative feedback rather than going around the houses. Slightly more tendency towards hierarchical. And it's not that I want to do that, but I answered it in terms of my last job. And for those of you who work in higher education, you can't really in a public meeting go against your seniors. They'll make your life really, really difficult. So that's why that's there. I have a preference for kind of top-down decision-making, which again makes sense because I have to make decisions all the time. More of a preference with relationship-based in terms of trust, and that's absolutely right. In fact, I thought that indicator would be far more towards the relationship base. And according to this, UK is more towards, as I mentioned, avoiding confrontation, but my preference is much more around let's talk about it openly and have a lively debate and have some confrontation. I thought my time would be extremely on the linear end, but actually it's slightly more, it is towards the linear end, but it's more flexible, sort of one notch above than the UK profile. And then in terms of persuading, I'm much more around I'm much more around principles first. So how do we give the principles and then the facts, and kind of getting buy-in from people, then the data first, and getting people on board that way, which is much more the UK is inclined that way. So of course we know these things aren't perfect, but it's really useful. So I really enjoyed doing that. So if you're interested, I've included the link in the show notes, and also to episode 47, How Culture and Leadership Combined, where I talk more about high and low context culture. And I also include a link to Erin Meyers' 2014 article in the Harvard Business Review about navigating the cultural minefield. So I really hope you found this episode useful, and don't forget to check out my cultural awareness training on the Diverse Minds website. You can have a look. So there are different training packages around a taster around cultural awareness, or more in depth around what is individual culture, team culture, organizational culture, and what might we like to do differently. And if you enjoyed this podcast, why not leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your show from, to encourage other people to listen. So thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next episode where I'll be talking about cultural appropriation. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.